Okay, so welcome to this Twilight session on biodiversity. As I said before, if you're just joining us, if you could please pop your name and school in the chat just so we can keep a track of registrations, that would be fantastic. And we'll get started with the session. So to start with, it would be really useful for me to know what you're hoping to get out of this session. So, what's brought you to this session? Is there particular questions you're looking to have answered? Any particular areas you're wanting to be covered? Just obviously we've got a session prepared, but I can flex and add bits in if there's anything particular that you do want to be covered in the session. So if there's anything you're particularly hoping to get out of it, you can either pop microphone on and share it or pop it in the chat. Or is everybody just not quite sure? Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing, Alison. So biodiversity, one of your actions for your eco plan. So looking for some ideas and guidance. That's fantastic. Anyone else, anything particular you're looking to get from the session? Introduction to Biodiversity for your Leaf Award and ideas for lessons. Fantastic. Different ideas, things others have done, Eco and Leaf Awards. Brilliant. So we're going to look at some specific activities today that hopefully will give you some inspiration for things to do. And I'll have a little talk around some of those as well. So you've got some more ideas and inspiration. That's really helpful. Thank you. Learn more to link with live lesson for pupils on Monday. Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about some of the links that you can make with the live lesson. So some of the topics that we'll be covering in the live lesson so that you've got an understanding of those as well. And also some activities that will tie in with things we're doing for the live lesson. Fantastic, that's really helpful. So hopefully I can give you a few more ideas and bits and pieces as we go. Brilliant. Oh, thank you very much as well. Yeah, knowledge and understanding of biodiversity crisis. So yeah, we'll definitely be covering that. Brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing that. So in today's session, we're going to talk about what is COP15 and how you can discuss it with your students. So that includes COP15 and also biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis and how you can think about discussing it with students of all ages. Thinking about COP15 and biodiversity activities for your settings. We've got a range of activities right from nursery up to high school, doing with lots of different things. So more kind of academic things you can do or more practical things you can do. So we'll go through a series of those, all of which you can use for your eco schools or your leaf action plans. And then at the end, there'll be a bit of time for questions. If you do have any questions, anything that I didn't cover, anything else that you want to ask me about, we'll have a bit of time at the end for that. So that's what we're going to cover today. So just before I get started, I just want to have a little discussion about a bit of that terminology, because there's quite a lot of words that come up when we discuss biodiversity that either educators or a lot of children and young people might not be so familiar with. So to make sure we're all on the same page, what is biodiversity? Does anybody want to give me what they would define as biodiversity in terms of the actual word? What would we define it as? Because this is a really important part to get started with, children and young people of all ages. When we use this word, we're talking about this big conference in biodiversity. What does it actually mean? So does anybody want to give me how they would define biodiversity? Anyone? All types of life and habitat. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for sharing. Natural world around us, how it grows, develops. Brilliant. So we're getting lots of different ideas about how, and there are lots of different ways you can define the term biodiversity. So generally, we can talk about biodiversity in terms of diversity of all life on Earth. And brilliant, someone's mentioned ecosystems as well. So there's lots of words in here that I'm going to go to define as well that are really helpful when you're talking about this. So in terms of biodiversity, generally what we're talking about is the number of different species and also the number of kind of animals or plants within each species. So for example, you could say an elephant and a giraffe are two species, but you're also concerned with how many elephants and how many giraffes you have. So good biodiversity is having healthy size of populations of lots of different types of animals and plants. So it's the diversity of all life on Earth, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria. We want good diversity across everything. And I mentioned that word species, which can be a bit of a tricky one to explain, particularly if you're talking to younger children. What is a species? So we would generally define a species as a group of organisms who can breed together and produce fertile offspring. So a good example of that, if you're talking to kind of children who are a bit older, can understand that. If you think of breeding a horse and a donkey, you can get a mule. So you can have an offspring, but the mule will not be able to breed. It can't produce offspring on its own. So that's quite a good example to use. It's not always clear cut. So again, this is getting into quite a technical side of things, which you don't necessarily need to. But just if you are dealing, talking to, particularly older pupils, species can be quite difficult to define because bacteria, for example, can exchange genetic information, but they're not actually breeding. So there's a bit of a debate as to what a species actually is and how you separate them out, which is why you quite often see in the news, oh, there's a new species of this or a new subspecies of that, because we're constantly trying to work out how things are related to each other. But really, it's a group of animals or plants or fungi that can breed together. So you can think about really younger pupils, it's just different types of animals and plants that they can see and then they can identify, and that has a different name is quite a good way of thinking about it for younger pupils. So we want lots and lots of different species. We want all different types of varieties. We also quite often use the term population, and part of the reason I want to define this is because it will become important for something I'm going to tell you about COP15 a bit later. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species. So you can have a population of elephants living in Africa, population of red squirrels in Scotland. So it's quite important to define that a population is different from a species. Someone mentioned the word habitat. So habitats are very important. So the habitat is the environment in which an animal or plant lives. Basically, it's home. And if an animal doesn't have the right habitat or a plant doesn't have the right habitat, it can't survive. So we need to look after habitats. And then we have ecosystems that someone mentioned as well. So ecosystems are communities of animals and plants and their physical environment. So it's all the animals and plants living in a space plus their physical environment. So from this picture here, you can see we've got trees and we've got flowers and shrubs and things. We're going to have lots of little beasties crawling around there. We might have mammals and birds living in this ecosystem, but we've also got some physical features, so non-living features. So things like you can see that wall there. There's going to be the slopes and the kind of the rocky substructure. That all forms the whole ecosystem. So the living and the non-living bits that kind of exist are the ecosystem. I can see that a few people have joined, so if you have joined us since we started, if you could please pop your name and school in the chat, that would be really, really helpful, just so we can keep a track of everyone that's come along. So these are some terms that I say you might, particularly for younger children, you might not need to get into the details of, but it's good for them to understand that there's lots of different types of animals and plants, and that we need lots of different types of animals and plants to have a healthy ecosystem, healthy ecosystems, and we'll talk about why that's so important a bit later. So now we're on the same page with terminology. No problems at all, Ms. Brooks, thank you for joining us. So we're going to have a little talk about COP15 and what it is and why it's important. So we'll start with a little bit of history. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, which a lot of you will be familiar with. Now, often the confusion comes because we're very much used to talking about COPs in terms of climate change. So obviously last year we had all the wonderful publicity around COP26 that took place in Glasgow. This year we had COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And often we talk about that, that's just COP, it's COP26, it's COP27. But it is the Conference of the Parties that is specifically talking about the Convention on Climate Change. So convention is another way of saying treaty. So we have these treaties that are agreed between huge numbers of countries, ratified by the United Nations. And then for some of these treaties particularly that need to be updated regularly or that require lots and lots of active discussion and lots of kind of countries working together to solve the problems, they will have a COP. So a conference that meets every so often to talk about that treaty and make new targets and decide new things. So there's lots of different ones, actually. There's COPs for nuclear weapons, for hazardous chemicals, for desertification. There's quite a few different ones. Climate change is the big one that we all know really well. But the principle is basically the same for this biodiversity one. So we're on and the number after it just indicates the number of times the conference has happened. And they will happen at different regularities. So the biodiversity one tends to be every couple of years. Climate change one tends to be every year, as you'll know from COP26 and COP27. So the Biodiversity Conference of Parties discusses the Convention or Treaty on Biological Diversity. So this was agreed in 1992 in Rio, and it was adopted. So this treaty was adopted by 196 of the UN member states. And every couple of years, they meet to discuss new targets and trying to push for new things. And the main aims of this treaty are to protect biodiversity, encourage sustainable resource use, and also fair benefit sharing. So that's basically any benefits that come out of the agreements and the targets on protecting biodiversity are shared fairly between the member states. So where and when is this COP, so COP15, taking place? So it's starting on 7th of December in Montreal, Canada. Now that COP for biodiversity has been delayed by a couple of years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And originally it was meant to take place in China, but due to ongoing restrictions in China in terms of COVID, it's now taking place in Canada. It will be kind of chaired or run by Chinese delegates. So it is still a kind of Chinese thing, even though it's taking place in Canada. And that just means that that's the country that's kind of running the agenda, really. And who's going to be attending? So there'll be representatives from all of the countries that are signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there'll also be delegates from stakeholders. So there'll be people from business and finance, community members. We might have scientists, people from Indigenous communities. Also, we'll have youth representatives as well. So it's really, really relevant for your children and young people. So they should be represented there as well. So that's the kind of bit of the bare bones, slightly more kind of dull side of things. In terms of what actually the point of things are and what point of COP15 is, so the main aims are to determine the global efforts for nature. So on a global scale, what can we do to help support nature and stop decline in biodiversity? And also agree targets to ensure species survival and stop ecosystem collapse. So that's again where these terms species and ecosystem really are valuable to know. So we need to protect species and we need to protect the environments that they live in. And there's quite a few issues currently on the table to be discussed. And unfortunately, some of it doesn't make the nicest reading. So the World Wildlife Foundation, the WWF, produced the Living Planet report, which they produce quite regularly. And the 2022 one identified that in the past 48 years, we've had a 69% decline in animal populations. Now, that's where the word population really becomes relevant, because it's not numbers of species. So we haven't had 69% of species becoming extinct, but overall numbers of animals have declined by 69%. And it's something that we might feel like, oh, you often think about these things as being really far away, but this is really close to home. So if you can remember when you were younger and you drive around and maybe it was time to go and clean the car, and quite often the car would be absolutely covered in bugs. So I remember like helping my dad to clean the car when I was little, and there would be so many bugs on the front of the car. It would take ages to clean them all off and they'd all be stuck on, and it was something that was really noticeable. And now if I clean my car, when that happens, which is not that often, there's hardly a bug there at all. So we are seeing massive decreases in animal populations close to home as well as overseas. So there is this is worldwide. Some areas are worse affected than others. And we often hear the term tipping points, but it has been identified by scientists that biodiversity is getting to a tipping point where if we go too much further, we're going to see a catastrophic decline in the numbers and different types of species. Another thing to note, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, is something to kind of is a really good one to talk about to your classes, is that climate change and biodiversity loss are really closely interlinked. So we've been quite focused rightly on climate change, and particularly with COP26, your children and young people have been really aware of climate change. And the links are really close. So they've got these separate conventions and we're thinking of them separately, but they really are interlinked. So particularly with climate change is really driving biodiversity loss, because the more species, the more the temperature changes, the more it changes habitats and ecosystems, and it's more difficult for animals to adapt and cope. So the faster things change, the less easy it is for them to cope. And we're losing a lot of animals because they can't survive where they were because the climate has changed so drastically. So we need to think about climate change, particularly when we're thinking about biodiversity. Unfortunately, so every 5 COPs is when they make the big targets. So the 5 COPs ago for biodiversity was COP10, and the way they made kind of big targets, and pretty much they've all not been met. Some have partially been met, a lot have not been met at all. So we're really not doing well in terms of actually taking action on the things that we know will help, which is not ideal. And there's one big aim that a lot of people are pushing for in regard, so non-governmental organisations, along with some governments, are really pushing for a target to protect 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030. So that's the 30 by 30 goal, which is quite a nice one to remember. Again, if you're talking to children and young people, it's quite an easy one to remember to talk about to them. So the idea is to, let's say, protect 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030, which does feel like a lot, but it's really essential if we're actually going to protect biodiversity. And what we need to make sure as well as part of COP is that we have the funding and resources available to do that, because there's not much point in saying, oh yeah, we've protected this big area of land, but there's no resources to protect it, so nothing's actually happening to look after it properly. So there's some not great news there. Things aren't going as we'd like them, but there are some hopeful things on the horizon. I'll come back to those in a little bit. So just again, thinking about, we're talking about COP, they're saying there's all these problems, we've got these big targets we need to aim for, we need to put lots of money and investment and time and energy into solving this. And the first question you kind of come to is why? Why are we bothering? Why is biodiversity actually important? Why do we need it? It's lovely to look out the window and see some pretty animals and plants and things, but what's actually the importance of it? So one way that we can think of this is by using a bit of a kind of metaphor or analogy. So I want you to imagine that every living thing on the earth is an orchestra, and every species is represented as a different person playing in the orchestra. And when everything's working together in all the different ecosystems, we get some wonderful music and it's all going well, the rhythms are working and everything's working really nicely. And in really healthy ecosystems with really good biodiversity, we can see that what happens is if we lose a couple of players in the orchestra, maybe they're sick or they couldn't come in that day, everything still kind of goes according to plan. So maybe we can lose a violinist, we can lose a trumpet player, and we're doing okay. Everything's still ticking along, the music's still playing, and everything's working nicely. However, as soon as we start to lose biodiversity, so we lose members of that orchestra, the fewer and fewer members we have, the more and more difficult it becomes to actually sustain the music. And also, the more likely we are that if we then lose one more, suddenly the music stops or carries on erratically and doesn't really work properly. So it's quite a nice analogy to think about, in ecosystems and global ecosystems as well, and think about, okay, this is actually how it works. If we have lots of different players doing lots of different things, we can have beautiful, really good music. And the more we remove from this system, the more dangerous it gets and the more likely things are to start to go wrong. So I have an interesting question for you, which is a good one that you can ask your children and young people, is where would you put humans in this orchestra? So which position would you put a human in? Where do you think they sit in this orchestra? Interesting. So we've got one person saying conductor so far. Please share. It's just a thought about where we would sit and how we influence things. So where would you put humans in the orchestra? Thank you guys who've shared already. That's really helpful. Anyone else want to venture? Where would you put humans? We've had a few conductors so far. Any advance on conductors or mostly conductor? First violins. Fabulous, thank you. Really interesting. Okay. Oh, percussion. Now, we were talking about this in the office, and someone was saying that percussion is actually the most important part because it sets the beat and the tempo, which is really interesting. So yeah, it's interesting that quite a few people said conductor or a kind of really important position. I would actually put humans in a not so important position in terms of how we actually feed into the music and making things work. So I'd maybe say we're second or third trumpet player, somewhere down the list. So we're there, we're making part of the music, but we're certainly not in charge. And it might feel like we're in charge because we constantly being told about all these awful things that human activity is causing and how the big effects that we can have. But actually, overall, we can't actually have a massive influence in terms of making different things happen. So we can certainly, at the moment, we're certainly putting everyone off their tune, and we're probably playing their own little, we're kind of sitting in the corner playing our own little erratic tune, and it's kind of generally messing things up. But I would definitely not put us as in charge. So it's a really interesting conversation, though, to have with your children and young people. If you want to use this analogy, where would you put the human? Because I think often people will think, we're the conductor. And I would probably say, if you want to take the analogy further, the conductor is probably more just the kind of the rhythms of the earth in terms of the kind of the non-living parts. So the weather and generally the climate. And we can influence the conductor, so we can influence the climate, but we're not in charge of it. So it's just something to have a think about. Really, thank you very much for those of you who participated, though. That's really helpful. So yeah, so we want to kind of keep this music going, but again, is that all important? And it really is, because we can sometimes think of ourselves, particularly these days, as being quite divorced from the natural world, and maybe we don't need the natural world because it's all a bit mucky and icky and cold and we can make it go away. But actually, we so incredibly are dependent on the natural world. Here's just a few examples of some of the things that we rely on the natural world for, and without good biodiversity, we won't have. Because as soon as we get into the stage of having poor biodiversity, we get things like monocrops in food, where we only have one crop growing, which makes it incredibly susceptible to disease and damage. And the same with lots of these other things. As soon as we get damage to biodiversity, these things just don't work as well. So again, something that you can have a discussion with your children and young people is think about all these things that and more that biodiversity gives us. Ask them to name some and try and think about the links. So, how does biodiversity give us clean air? So then you can talk about trees and plants respiring and taking carbon dioxide out of the air. We can talk about different animals and plants absorbing pollutants. And also thinking, you can ask them about, well, what would you save if you had to pick your top 3 things? And obviously, actually, you need all of them. But that's really the thing. It's one of the key things to think about. Was when we think about biodiversity, often it's kind of seen as we don't really need that. We don't really need nature. Oh, yeah, it's very nice to have these pretty animals and things, but we're not reliant on it. And actually, we are massively reliant on all of this working. And if our ecosystems start collapsing, we're suddenly going to be in big, big trouble. So I've got another little query for you. Again, another one that you can have a go at with your children and young people if you want to. So I'm going to give you an odd one out. So I'm going to show you a few different things, and I want you to see if you can figure out which one is the odd one out. And just so you're aware, we will be sharing the slides as well. So if you do want to use any of the slides with stuff you're doing in class as well, you're more than welcome to. So which one would you say is the odd one out in that list? Got one coming in, thank you. Couple coming in. Quite a few. Everyone's saying the same so far. Anyone who's want to tell me why they think the one that they've said? Everyone said the same one so far. Be good to try this out with your pupils and see if they get the same answer as you. Anyone want to tell me why they've selected the one that they selected? Fabulous. Oh, brilliant. You all pass with flying colours. Yep, so volcanic eruption, because it's the only one that's now interesting that use the term naturally, because I would still consider humans to be natural. I think we can actually run into a bit of trouble by saying that we are not natural. Humans are completely unnatural. We are natural beings, and we just behave in very interesting ways because we've got slightly big brains that sometimes run us into trouble. But absolutely, so it's very much that a volcanic eruption is something that is not man-made, and all of the other things, unfortunately, are things that are man-made. And so this is why we're having a biodiversity crisis, because so much of the things that we are doing are impacting on biodiversity. So a big volcanic eruption, particularly in somewhere like an island, can have a massive detrimental impact on biodiversity. But all of these other things that we're doing have global impacts and cause massive change, massive problems. I could have included, if you want to discuss things like past extinctions and dinosaurs, you could include the example of a meteor strike. That's another one that definitely wipes out some biodiversity. But in terms of what's happening at the moment, we do seem to be into the next big global extinction, which is caused by man-made change. So climate change, deforestation, oil spills, introducing invasive species. So that's species that are introduced into an area where they're not normally from, and then they start to cause damage. So, for example, introducing rats onto islands, into island populations. Also, things like grey squirrels in the United Kingdom is quite a good example of that. So we're causing a lot of problems, and part of what we're causing problems by is a lot of it, as I said before, is to do with food production. So food production is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. And this is a really nice image that can illustrate that quite well, particularly for kind of older pupils, that you can kind of use these kind of visual representations with. So this is Earth's land mammals by weight. So it's not all animals, it's just land mammals. But it shows you from all of the land mammals on Earth, humans are the big dark grey blob in the middle, and then all the light grey blobs are our pets and livestock. So you can see the number of our pets and livestock that are taking up the planet, and all of the other land animals are squeezed into the tiny little green squares around the outside. So we are having a massive impact by our sheer numbers, and also the sheer numbers of livestock and pets that we keep as well. That's only a few species that's taking up most of that land mass. So not good for biodiversity. There's not much diversity there. There's just a few species. So unfortunately, things are being driven by humans. Again, I will come back to hopeful messages in just a second. But the one more thing that I want to do before we talk about some of the activities and things and how to deliver more of a hopeful message is just to remind you of that link between biodiversity and climate change, because you'll know from trying to make links between subject areas, making links is a really, really good tool to be using. So trying to think about the links, all our 10 topics in eco-schools, they're not separate. They are all part of the same things, and they're all interlinked. So biodiversity and climate action are really closely interlinked. And it's going to be good to have actually, again, thinking about kind of conversations to have in class. And you can think about debates as well, is that when we're taking action for both of these things, some things that we do will help both of these. So for example, we want to plant some trees because trees will absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, reducing the effects of climate change. And also, if we plant some trees, we can create some lovely tree-based ecosystems and improve biodiversity. Win-win. Unfortunately, though, there are some things that we do as part of climate change action that has negative effects on biodiversity, and it's good to kind of remember that and consider those as well. So just to give you a wee example briefly, a lot of what we're doing in terms of climate change requires us to take up lots of green technologies like LED lights, electric cars, wind power plants, which are all great for climate change. Unfortunately, they require the mining of things called rare earths, which are types of metals. They're not actually that rare, but they're very difficult to get at, which is why they're called rare. And this picture is a rare earth mine in China. And the process to extract rare earths causes huge amounts of pollution. And there's lots of new mines planned, particularly for areas like Africa. So they're planning to mine areas in things like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have really biodiversity important rainforests and other areas. So so it can be quite an interesting debate to have, is thinking about, is extraction of these minerals justified to solve climate change if it damages biodiversity in the process? So again, thinking about these kind of two things and how we can actually help with both of these, rather than just if we focus on one, sometimes it means that we actually damage something else that we also need to survive. So that's quite a lot of bad news and a lot of feeling quite bad about humans and their place in the natural world. And it can obviously cause huge amounts of anxiety. You know, here's another crisis to worry about. As if the climate crisis wasn't bad enough, here's another crisis for you to have to worry about. And climate and environmental anxiety is a major problem, not just in terms of mental health, which obviously is a massive problem, but also in terms of actually going and doing something about it. If we're terrified, we freeze and we don't actually go and do something about it. And that can be as bad as just pretending like it's not happening at all. So we want to actually encourage children and young people to think about this in a way that is a bit more positive and have hope about the ability of us to recover from this and to make changes. So when we are talking to children and young people about these problems, we want to try and kind of have a bit more of a positive message. So you can do that in various ways. One way of thinking about it that we'd recommend is having a think about this acronym HEAP. So we've adapted this. So WWF for COP26, the climate change COP, created this acronym, and we've just adapted a bit to have a think about for your pupils. So when you're giving messages about the biodiversity crisis and other environmental concerns, trying to think about a hopeful message, and I can definitely give you some tools as to how to look at this in a hopeful way, because that's more engaging and motivating. We're more likely to be able to get people to go and change what they're doing and take action if we're feeling more hopeful. Also thinking about trying to be empathetic, so considering how pupils are approaching the issue, whether they've got any direct links to what's happening with biodiversity. Are they anxious, maybe that family members or other members of the community aren't engaging with the issue? We want to give children and young people the opportunity to take action, which is where some of the activities I'm going to suggest in a second will come in. So the best way to make hope feel real and to counteract helplessness is to give someone something to do, something they can positively do to help to make change. And also to really make us feel like we are, powerful. Everyone's actions can make a difference. And there's lots of things that you can do that can really make a difference. And one of the really nice things actually about taking action for biodiversity is it's a really positive thing to do, and it's really good in terms of mental health, because a lot of actions for biodiversity involve spending time in nature, in contact with nature and outside, which is really, really good for mental health and well-being. So it is a kind of nice opportunity actually to do something really positive and hopeful in terms of environmental action. And so one way that we can start to think about actually being hopeful and positive is I'm going to show you a graph in a second that comes from this report. So this is from the Global Biodiversity Outlook #5. They produce several of them. So this comes from the United Nations part that looks at the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this graph shows is a timeline from 2000 on the left right up to 2050 on the right. The black line that you can see that starts up in the top left corner and runs down to the bottom right corner is the decline in biodiversity that we've been seeing. So from 2000, we've seen this sharp decline in biodiversity in animal populations. And then at the point at which we're at just now, so 2022, suddenly these colours start to appear. And the line kind of carrying all the way down to the bottom is what happens if we do nothing. Business as usual. We're going to see this catastrophic continuation of the catastrophic decline in biodiversity. However, if we start to make changes and do things, we can reverse this trend, and we can reverse it quickly. So that's the thing. That's what this graph shows, is that you can see that if we do all of the things on the right, we can actually reverse the current biodiversity crisis and get back to levels that we were at in 2000 within about 25-30 years, which is not long. When we often think about, trying to make these changes, and, we think, oh, am I actually going to see these changes have an effect in my lifetime? And with biodiversity, we really actually can. Children and young people can watch these changes happen if we can get together and actually do some of these things. The other nice thing about all these things that are listed is that they work in synergy. So the more we do of each of them, they will accelerate each other and help each other to kind of actually drive this improvement in biodiversity. And you can get children and young people to maybe have a think about, what things could they do for each one. So some are fairly obvious. So conservation restoration is just basically restoring and enhancing ecosystems. Climate change action is anything that you're doing for climate change. Other drivers is things like pollution. So if you're going out and doing things like litter picking, anything that reduces pollution in your local area, Things like over-exploitation of resources, so not taking more than you need. Sustainable production, so we're thinking about only buying things that are produced in a sustainable way that's not damaging the planet to create them. And reducing consumption, so just having less stuff. So all of that, which is often actually a lot of you that are doing eco schools or leaf work, a lot of you will be doing a lot of this stuff anyway, but it all helps biodiversity, it's all linked. And like I say, the more that we can do, the more these things work together and can really improve things. And it can work. So just to give you an example, in 1982, they banned commercial whaling. And since then, we've now seen a kind of 6-fold increase in the population of whales like humpback whales. So they've gone from 10,000–15,000 right up to 80,000 within that time period. So these populations can really recover and we can really help these ecosystems. So it's really important to kind of stress that hopeful message. So the next thing that I'm going to do is go through just a few activities that we kind of recommend as options to get involved in biodiversity and COP15. Just before I get onto that bit, does anybody have any questions at this stage? I see time is slipping away fast, so we'll make sure that we're finished by 5. If anybody does have any questions, just do pop them in the chat. So I'm going to carry on. So we've got these 5 different activities, and I'll go through each one in turn. And they're all about trying to understand things a bit better, connecting to the issues, and then taking action. So for pupils that are maybe probably upper primary and older, this TED Ed video is really good. Now, just to make it clear for all of these activities, anything that's underlined is a link. So I'll send you the slides tomorrow and you can click on the links, but I'll also, in the email where I send you the slides, I'll give you all the links as well. So you'll have all the links to all of these activities if there's anything that you want to do. So this is just a short video that explains biodiversity and its importance from the TED Education group. It's a really nice video. It's also got some accompanying questions for discussion and additional resources if you want to expand things. But if you're just looking for a simple way to explain this to slightly older pupils, that's a really good starting place. For younger pupils, generally it's probably having discussions or thinking about stories and things that you can talk about with them. And then another thing to think about in terms of understanding COP15, a nice thing to maybe try as an activity is a start-stop discussion. And you can do this with pretty much any age group, but obviously just varying in terms of differentiating for the individual needs in terms of the things that you're asking them, they're coming up with really. So you can do a 2-part start-stop discussion. So what we do with a start-stop discussion is we basically have a question, think about what the goal is, and then say, right, what should people start doing and stop doing to make this happen? So question would be, for a kind of global perspective, what do world leaders need to agree to stop or start COP15 to safeguard biodiversity for the future? And then you can come up with a goal. So for example, for COP15, we might say on a global scale, we want to reverse the global decline in biodiversity and protect 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030. So that's that 30 by 30 goal. And then you basically just ask your children and young people to say, what do you want to start doing? What do you think we should stop doing? And you can give them time to come up with examples. And there's lots of different ideas you can come up with. So just a few, you can maybe talk about creating a better food system, restoring damaged ecosystems, controlling invasive species, protecting and conserving natural areas on land and in seas. And these are obviously for slightly older pupils, but even for really young pupils, you can think about things like just protecting natural spaces, looking after our animals and plants, things that we want governments to start doing. And stop. So we want to stop them chopping down trees. We want to stop them backing things like fossil fuel extraction, so stop doing anything that's bad in terms of climate change. We want to stop them damaging natural areas for things like building and mining. And we want to stop them damaging, you think about local ecosystems like peat bogs that are really important. We want to stop damage to those as well. So again, it's quite a nice one because you can really get a good brainstorm going as to things that we need to start and stop. And that's quite a global one. So if you want to do something that was a bit more maybe local, then think about maybe it's quite a good one for brainstorming for ideas for eco schools actions to get your children and young people really involved in that planning actions for if you're doing a biodiversity topic or if you're thinking about doing some things for your LEAF award. So what can you do to help safeguard biodiversity for the future? And maybe goal would be to improve biodiversity in your school grounds or your playground, your local community, and maybe to do something like help and protect with global biodiversity. Think big. And again, start and stop. So does anybody have any ideas of start and stop? What things could you start doing at more of a school level and or stop doing to help with biodiversity? So this is quite a nice one because you can do it with pretty much any age group. Oh, brilliant. Got some come in. Plant trees. Definitely you can plant trees. That will definitely help with biodiversity. Anything else that people think we could start doing? Planting native species of wildflower garden. That sounds lovely. Yeah, wildflowers. Change a grass area into wildflower area. So yeah, lots of things like planting and growing is fantastic. Stop leaving lights on. Yes, good. So stop wasting energy is really good. Plant trees and bushes, plants, fruit, wildflowers, bird feeders and bug hotels. Brilliant. So thinking about supporting some specific populations of animals. And bug hotels are brilliant. Bug hotels are great fun for whatever age you're looking after. Oh, fantastic. So sponsor wild animals with WWF. Yeah, absolutely. So for thinking on global stage, how can you support some of the organizations that are looking after global biodiversity? Brilliant. So you don't need me. You've already got lots of ideas. And one thing to think about again is thinking about food. So encouraging sustainable food consumption. Like I say, food production is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. We saw that from that number of livestock that we have. So thinking about more sustainable food options can be great. Planting wildflowers and trees, just like you already said. Someone's just mentioned ponds. I will come back to ponds as well, because ponds are a fantastic way to help with biodiversity. Things like leaving areas of grass untrimmed is really good. So to improve create more habitats for wildlife. And as someone said with WWF, supporting causes that champion biodiversity. I can see, oh, fabulous. Someone else has got an excellent one. So using the Seek app to identify and monitor biodiversity in the school grounds. Absolutely. So thinking about how you can actually monitor things as well, because when we monitor things, as you know from your eco school, anyone who's doing eco schools, if we keep an eye on things, we can see how we're making changes over time. And we can also use that information to decide what we need to do differently to really help. That's fantastic. Oh, and brilliant also, stop bringing plastic packaging. Yes, definitely, and reducing litter. So you've all got mine that I've had anyway. So yeah, stop wasting food, stop wasting energy, like you said. Stop using single-use plastic. Really good for the environment, because plastic, if anybody came to our plastic pollution live lesson, if you didn't, you can watch it back, have a look on our website. Really good to help with reducing pollution in the environment. Also thinking about, what's getting used in your school grounds. Are pesticides and herbicides still being used? Go and find out from your groundskeepers, from your local council, stop these kind of chemicals being used, because they'll really damage local wildlife. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, hedgehog and bat houses and litter picks as well. Brilliant. So all of these things will help with biodiversity. And it's another good one for learning is actually talk about why. Why does doing a litter pick help with biodiversity? Why does reducing single-use plastic help with biodiversity? Really good to actually have those conversations as well. Oh, and yet one of my favorites, write letters to politicians, because that's part of COP. We want the youth voice should be heard at COP15. So yeah, the more letters you can write to your local politicians, the better, to encourage them to push for the targets to be high and for them to actually be met as well. Because it's all very well and good making these targets. If they're not met, it's no good. So absolutely write letters. So once you've done, another thing you can do as well to think about, learn a bit more about biodiversity and how it works, is to have a think about wolves. So this is one that we're recommending for this one. So this is a kind of slightly differentiated activity for different age groups. So if you've got younger pupils, so kind of nursery up to maybe P3, I'd recommend that you go and have a look at our live lesson from Climate Action Week if you've not already seen it. That was for early years. It was a reading of the book The Last Wolf, a bit about climate change in there as well. But this was our author Minnie Gray, and it was a fantastic lesson. And it talked about climate change, but it also really talked about what's happening when we damage our forests, and the fact that we used to have wolves and bears and lynx in this country, and we don't anymore. And what that means and what we can do to maybe help the environments that these animals used to live in. And she's got some really great calls to action in terms of going and planting trees. So it's really, really nice lesson to go and have a look at. There's lots of resources that go along with it as well. So have a look at that one if you've got early years pupils. And afterwards, maybe have a little conversation with them, because even really younger pupils can have a think about the pros and cons of reintroducing wolves to Scotland. So who's that going to affect and why? And you know, would it be a good thing or not to have wolves in Scotland? And then for older pupils, so kind of upper primary into secondary, we'd recommend having a look at the How Wolves Change Rivers video. So for high schools in particular, our live lesson, this is going to be part of our live lesson. There's a lesson plan that goes with it. If you've got upper primary pupils, though, that you think you'd like to do a debate activity with, you can have a look at our high schools. The high schools resource will just be on the web page because it's a pre-recorded session. So you can have a look at the resource in this as well, that goes along with that as well, on how wolves change rivers. So this is a video about Yellowstone National Park in America and how so wolves were extinct in Yellowstone. They reintroduced them in 1995. And then this video is about all of the things that happened, the amazing things that happened when they put wolves back into that environment. Because you'd think they just have these little small effects maybe on populations of deer and elk, but they changed the entire ecosystem for the better. And they also changed rivers. I'm not going to give away how they change rivers. You can go and watch the video. It's not a long video. It's only about 5 minutes or so. But it's a really interesting video to learn about how one species can have such a massive impact on the whole ecosystem, including the non-living parts of the ecosystem, because we tend to think about, well, how do they get influenced by a wolf? So go and have a look at the video. And like I say, we've got an accompanying lesson plan about how you can have a proper debate style activity about wolf reintroduction in Scotland, about whether some of the changes that we've seen in Yellowstone would be beneficial here. But obviously we've got a very different population in Scotland. It's much more highly populated than in the kind of wildernesses of America. So it can be a really interesting conversation to have, because these are the conversations that are happening all of the time about biodiversity, and about how you know, what's the pros and cons of doing all these things and how improving things for biodiversity impacts humans. So it can be really interesting. I've just seen a question. Yeah, I think beavers were introduced into Scotland as a biodiversity initiative. Absolutely, they have been. So they're being introduced in a couple of places. One on the west coast, and that was intentional. There was an unintentional release of beavers around the Tay, the Tay estuary. Sorry, not the Tay River. So there are currently 2 populations of wild beavers in Scotland. And again, in the lesson plan resource, one of the extension activities is to go and learn a bit about the beaver reintroduction and what kind of effects that's had and some of the pros and cons that have been found in terms of how the beavers are getting on, because they are now established as populations and they are a protected species in Scotland. So there's a couple of links. Nature Scot have some really good resources about the beaver reintroduction. So yeah, definitely a good one to go and have a look at as well while you're looking at the wolves. So that's a really nice, these are kind of bigger lessons that, that you can do just to get a bit more understanding of how all these different species affect each other. So a third activity which we recommend, which is one about really connecting children and young people to nature, is perspective drawing and writing. So this is an activity that we're going to be doing as part of the live lessons for upper primary. It'll also be included in the resources for high schools, but you can also do it with young children of really, you know, nursery age and up. The idea is to imagine you are an animal or a plant. So ask children and young people to go outside into your grounds and just spend some time looking at what's around them and imagine that they are one of the plants or animals that they can see, and then either write or draw. So write a piece, you know, a story or a description, or draw what the world looks like from that animal or plant's point of view. So you could have a bird flying overhead and it sees this, you know, your school or nursery from the top down and how that looks, and think about what, you know, the animals are hearing. Maybe you could have, you know, a worm that's crawling through the ground and what soil tastes. Imagine what soil tastes like and how it can't really see, and thinking about all the different senses that animals use. So again, a really good way to connect pupils with nature and also learn quite a bit about, you know, biology as well. So thinking about, you know, can worms hear? You know, what does can a tree see? You can really think about some of these kind of sensory perceptions of different plants and animals as part of this, and you can share each children's drawings and stories and things. Could be a really nice way of kind of sharing all that information. So again, there will be a lesson plan to go with this Imagine You Are activity as part of the Biodiversity Live lesson next week. So you can get that on the website. You know, whether or not you come to the live lesson, you can get those resources on the live lesson page. And if you want to take this even further, like I said, we can think about, you know, can trees see and can earthworms hear? You can also think about some of the amazing extrasensory perceptions that animals have compared to us. So for example, you could think about kestrels, because kestrels can see ultraviolet light, so they can see mouse pee and vole pee, and they can use that to find where the mice and voles have gone. Generally, I find if you mention the word pee with small children, they tend to get quite excited, or certainly mine does anyway. So that can be quite a nice one. The other one is rats. So generally malign species. They're actually one of my favorites. But did you know that rats can hear things that we can't hear? So they can hear right up in the ultrasonic range, not as high as bats, but it's between us and what bats can hear, up in the ultrasonic range. And you can actually get recordings of these communications. So this is just an image of the chatter between rats that we can't hear. And some of it is, you know, where are you? What are you doing? They use this communication between themselves. It's kind of happy communication. And some of this we actually think is rats laughing. So if you tickle rats, they will make these sounds. You can't hear them, but if you put a little detector on, you can detect these sounds. So you could think about, you know, what other animals might have laughter. How do animals hear and sense the worlds around them? You can think about bats and echolocation and things. So it can be really nice to think about different animals' perspectives. So I know quite a few of you mentioned trying to actually do some practical things and get planting, and it can be quite daunting to know where to get started with some of that. I know quite a few of you for your LEAF award, the pilot schools might be thinking about doing some biodiversity planting. And I know a lot of people for eco schools might want to do that. And I say it's great to get, you know, children and young people outside, getting their hands dirty, getting them really up close and personal to nature, and really having a positive effect on their local area. So we have some great resources to help support that. So we have a set of resources from Garden for Life, which have some beautiful images and some ideas about how you can make your school grounds much more wildlife friendly. So how you can do all of these elements to create a wildlife garden. We've got suggestions for wildflowers to plant, different things to, you know, how to create bug hotels. There's loads in there. Again, that's a clickable link, and I'll send you the link in an email tomorrow. Really great resources. We also had a mini live lesson a couple of weeks ago from our charity Frog Life, who did a brilliant session on how to build a pond. So if you're interested in building ponds, now that's kind of big ponds with proper pond liners, or even just wee container ponds can have a massive impact on biodiversity. Having a reliable water source available is really key for so many species. And there's great resources along with that live lesson on how to build a pond, and also to learn more about a lot of the species that live in and around ponds as well. So I'd recommend that one. So that's great places to start if you want to do some planting. And then the final one that I'd recommend if you're wanting to get started with biodiversity as a topic is to do some campaigning for change. So someone already mentioned, you know, sponsoring an animal with WWF, and we also mentioned, you know, starting to contact politicians, which is all of that is brilliant. So arguably, this is one of the most important things to do. Giving children and young people a voice and allowing them to use it is one of the biggest things that's going to make a change. We can do lots of individual actions, which are all great, but it's really that working together and putting pressure on those in power to make change that's going to really make the difference. So we do have a letter and email writing resource that just gives you a template to get started from, particularly for children and young people that haven't really written letters or formal letters or emails before. You know, if they can write a really in a kind of nice formal structure, it's more likely to have an impact with the people they're writing to. And we are very much championing the concept of being annoying. Encourage children and young people to be annoying, to question things, to ask for change, and to use their voices to make that change happen. So that's definitely something that you can get involved in doing, and you can find out more about the issues by doing that. So that's the kind of main activities that we kind of recommend as a starting point for getting involved in COP15 and biodiversity. We would definitely recommend that if you haven't done so, you all sign up to our live lessons. So you can register on the Eco Schools live lesson page. That's also a clickable link when I send you the slides. We've got early years, upper primary and high school sessions. The early years will be off to the zoo, the Edinburgh Zoo, to meet some cockroaches, some armadillos and some rhinos. So definitely wouldn't miss that one. Upper primary will be going to the Highland Wildlife Park and hopefully seeing some snow leopards and some Arctic foxes, and also hearing from Sarah Roberts, who's an amazing animal behaviourist and author, who's going to give us some information about, you know, all of her different amazing work as well. And then our high school lesson will be actually some of the kind of content that we've talked about today at a level for high school pupils, along with that wolf reintroduction debate and how wolves change rivers. So do sign up. We'll also have our assembly on Friday. And yeah, sorry, I can see a question coming in. Are the live lessons recorded? They absolutely are. All of our previous live lessons are available on the website, and they will be posted. They're usually posted the same day or the day later. So you should be able to go on our website and have a look at the recordings, and all the resources that go with the lessons will also be on our website as well. So I've got two sets of people asking. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we always record all of our live lessons. So yeah, not a problem at all to watch the recordings back. And you don't need to register to do that because they do all just go up on the website. So just as a summary of the things that I've covered, so COP15 is important because we're running out of time to save the animals and plants that we all depend on. And the main aim of COP15 is to reverse the global decline in biodiversity and protect 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030. So that's that 30 by 30 goal. And you can get your pupils involved by understanding and caring about the issues through some of the activities we talked about, trying to help restore your local ecosystems, and making a noise and campaigning to try and make change happen. Go and annoy your politicians. It's definitely a good thing to do. So we've managed to make it just before 5. I do have a little bit of time if anybody has any questions. Oh, sorry, I can also just seen a question. What to say? So the upper stages. So upper primary will be going to the Highland Wildlife Park and having a think about animals that live in the Arctic tundra, and also how climate change has affected some of these species, particularly with camouflage and things. And then we'll have a little bit from author Sarah Roberts about her kind of amazing career and work with in animal behaviour, and also looking at some of the adaptations that animals make and how better biodiversity is better for everyone. Each session will also have a bit of information about COP15 as well, so you'll get, pupils will get a bit of a background about what COP15 is and why biodiversity is important. But yeah, it does sound amazing. I'm really looking forward to it. I won't be presenting, but I will be definitely watching, because they're going to be great set of live lessons next week. So does anybody have any other questions? Like I say, this session has been recorded. I will be putting it up on and posting out the link tomorrow, along with the slides, and also links to all the resources that I talked about. So if anybody has any questions, keep them coming in. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. And I look forward to seeing lots of you at the live lesson next week.